Tonight's story is an original mystery inspired by documented wilderness disappearances and real missing persons investigations. While the investigative procedures reflect real-world practices, the characters, locations, and events are fictional. My wife disappeared at 1:17 p.m. on a Saturday in July. The trail was busy. The sky was clear. She was visible to multiple people in the seconds before she vanished. No one saw her leave. No one saw where she went. In 7 years, no one has been able to explain how. My name is Daniel Holt. I'm 52 years old. I was 45 when it happened. I spent 20 years as a civil litigation attorney before I took early retirement, which means I know how to evaluate evidence, and I know how to identify when evidence is insufficient. I know the difference between an unanswered question and an unanswerable one. I have not yet determined which category this falls into. Her name was Rachel. Rachel Ann Holt. She was 43 years old, 5 feet 6 inches, 130 pounds. Brown hair she kept to her shoulders. She had been hiking since her early 20s. She was the kind of person who stopped for things most hikers walked past. A particular lichen on a rock face. A single wildflower growing through a crack in the granite. On our hikes, she would often fall behind. Not because she was tired, but because something had caught her attention. She would catch up 2 minutes later with the camera out, having photographed something I had walked straight past. She called this paying attention. She said most people on trails were just moving through places instead of being in them. She had completed significant trails in 4 mountain ranges and was, by any reasonable measure, an experienced and competent hiker. She was not a person who disappeared. She was not a person who left. She was a person who was there and then was not in broad daylight on a busy trail in front of witnesses. I have spent 7 years trying to understand how that happened. This is what I know. We were in Ironwood National Park on the Cold Divide Trail in the Spruce Basin area. One of the more popular trails in the park, not crowded in the way that front country trails can be crowded, but busy enough that on a clear July Saturday, you encounter other hikers regularly. We had passed 11 separate groups on the way up that morning. The trail runs along a high ridge, with views into multiple drainages. Well-maintained, well-marked, documented to approximately 8,500 feet at the high point. The section where Rachel disappeared was at approximately 6,400 feet, on a descending section of the ridge with good visibility in multiple directions. We had been hiking together for 14 years, at least once a month in good weather, more in summer. We had been arguing. I want to be direct about this because it was documented in the investigation, and I won't pretend otherwise. We argued on the trail that morning about something I won't describe in detail because it has no bearing on what happened, and I have our children to consider. We argued, and we reconciled. By the time we reached the high point of the trail at approximately noon, we were walking together normally, talking. The argument was done. I know people have read significance into that. I'll address it directly later. She disappeared 90 minutes after the reconciliation. The last time I saw Rachel myself was at approximately 1:12 p.m. We had stopped at a viewpoint, a wide section of trail with a rock bench looking north into the tamarack drainage. We ate the last of our lunch there. She took 2 photographs of the drainage. She had a specific habit at viewpoints. She always took one shot first. then set the camera down and spent a few minutes just looking before deciding whether to take another. She said photographs were better when you'd already absorbed a place. The second image of the drainage is noticeably different from the first. More considered. She set her pack down at the bench and said she wanted to go back for something she'd seen on the way past. A section of wildflowers on the slope above the trail, roughly 150 meters back up the ridge. She said she would be back in 10 minutes. She took her camera. She left her pack. She walked back up the trail. I watched her go until she rounded the curve in the ridge and was out of my sight. I did not see her again. What happened in the next 17 minutes has been documented more thoroughly than almost any wilderness disappearance I've found in 7 years of research. 6 separate groups of hikers were in the relevant section of trail between 1:10 and 1:30 p.m. Several had cameras or phones with time-stamped photographs. Several were debriefed so shortly after the event that their accounts are considered highly reliable by the investigators who spoke with them. I am going to describe the timeline carefully, because the timeline is the center of this case. It is the thing that should make the disappearance explicable, and instead makes it inexplicable. At approximately 1:10 p.m., a couple I'll call the Nordstroms, they have asked for privacy, were descending the trail when they passed Rachel ascending. They noted her specifically because she smiled and asked about the wildflowers above the trail. Mrs. Nordstrom told her they were particularly good this year and pointed to the slope. Mr. Nordstrom recalled Rachel continuing up the trail at a normal pace. They estimated she was roughly 100 meters above the viewpoint when they passed her. At approximately 1:14 p.m., a solo hiker named Gerald Cross was ascending the same section. He passed Rachel. He remembered her because she stepped aside to let him pass on the narrow section, and they exchanged a brief word about the view. He continued upward and did not look back. He placed her at roughly 130 meters above the viewpoint. His GPS watch data confirmed his position at 1:14 p.m. At approximately 1:17 p.m., a family of 4 named Whitmore was descending. The mother, who later gave the most detailed account, saw Rachel ahead of them on the trail, stationary, standing at the edge of the trail, looking up at the slope above. This witness watched Rachel for roughly 15 to 20 seconds before rounding a curve in the trail that put Rachel out of sight. She noted nothing unusual. Rachel appeared to be examining the wildflowers on the slope. When the Whitmores passed the area where Rachel had been standing, approximately 2 to 3 minutes later, Rachel was not there. At approximately 1:19 p.m., an ascending couple passed through the same section. They did not see Rachel. They had heard the Whitmore family talking about the view and were specifically looking at the slope themselves. They described the trail ahead as clear. Rachel was last confirmed seen at 1:17 p.m. 2 minutes later, she was gone. The section of trail between the 1:17 sighting and the 1:19 negative confirmation is roughly 40 meters long. The slope above rises at a steep angle, with intermittent rock outcropping and flower meadow. Below the trail, the terrain drops into a talus field and then a drainage. The Whitmores saw Rachel step off the trail toward the slope. They did not see her after that. They did not see her fall. They did not see her run. They didn't hear anything. She moved toward the slope, and 2 minutes later the trail was empty. The witness timeline was the strongest the investigation would ever have. It was also the thing that made the case impossible to close. I was sitting at the viewpoint at 1:30 p.m. when I checked my watch and realized it had been 18 minutes. 10 was what she had said. At 20 minutes, I walked up the trail. At 25 minutes, I reached the section of wildflowers. She was not there. I called her name. I walked the slope above the trail for 200 meters in each direction. I walked the trail for 300 meters above and below the wildflower section. I descended to the edge of the Tolis field and called into the drainage below. Nothing. At 1:52 p.m., I flagged down a descending group and asked them to contact the ranger station when they reached the trailhead. I also activated the personal locator beacon I carry on all our hikes. In retrospect, I should have activated it sooner. At the time, I was still in the phase where I expected to find her around the next corner. What I think about now is not the beacon. It is the first 5 minutes at the wildflower section, standing on the trail, looking at the slope, at the talus below, at the ridge above. There was a specific stillness in the air, the kind that settles when there has been no one around for a while. She had not been there recently. I knew that in the first minutes. I kept searching anyway. The park emergency response was fast. A ranger was on the trail within an hour and 40 minutes of my beacon activation. By 4:30, there were 12 searchers on the cold divide. By evening, a full SAR activation was underway. The incident commander for the first 3 days was a ranger named Chris Varela. 14 years with the park, 8 previous SR operations. He briefed me on day 1 in the tone that experienced coordinators use. Not falsely reassuring, not alarmist, factual and process-oriented. He said, "We have a well-defined last known position, good weather, and a bounded section of trail to work from. The witness timeline is unusually clear. We're in good shape for an initial search," he said. Adults who disappear on busy trails generally fall into a small number of categories: medical event, disorientation, injury from terrain, deliberate departure. We're going to work all of them. I said, "She didn't leave voluntarily," he said. "We take that seriously. We also work every possibility." I understood. I did not fight it. Day 1 covered the relevant section of trail and surrounding terrain at high density. The wildflower meadow where the Whitmores had last seen Rachel was covered by 3 separate teams. They found nothing. No disturbance of vegetation consistent with a fall or rapid traverse. No dropped item. No footprint in the softer soil sections. The talus field below the trail was searched by a technical team with rope access equipment. The drainage below was walked for a mile in each direction. Nothing. Day 2, dogs arrived. 2 teams working from Rachel's fleece that was in her pack at the viewpoint. Both dogs tracked from the viewpoint up the trail to the wildflower section. One entered the slope above and worked it for 30 minutes before losing the trail in the rockier terrain above. The other extended east along the ridge. No body. No biological material. No clothing. The search had everything working in its favor. Clear weather, a defined last known point, strong witness accounts, trained dogs, experienced teams. It was producing nothing. Day 3 was when the case changed. The Park Service sent 2 investigators to interview every witness who could be located. The Nordstroms had left their information at the trailhead. Gerald Cross had spoken to rangers directly on his descent. The Whitmore family was contacted through a volunteer program they were affiliated with. The ascending couple from 119 were located the following week through social media posts about the search. All 6 accounts were collected. All 6 were consistent with the timeline. And all 6, examined together, produced a problem the investigators documented and could not resolve. Between the Whitmore family's last sighting of Rachel at 117 and the ascending couple's negative sighting at 119, there is a 2-minute window. In that window, Rachel moved off the trail toward the slope above. The Whitmores had partial visual of that section of trail for most of those 2 minutes. They saw Rachel move toward the slope. Then the trail curved and they lost sight of her. The ascending couple arrived from below approximately 2 minutes later. They were looking at the slope. Rachel was not visible. The section of slope above the trail where Rachel was seen moving has no terrain feature that provides concealment from the trail within the first 50 meters. It is open wildflower meadow. A standing person is visible from the trail for the full width of it. In 2 minutes, on an open mountainside in clear weather, Rachel became invisible to anyone on the trail. Chris Varela told me on day 3. The witness timeline is the strongest I've worked with. Normally, we have gaps we're trying to fill in. Here the gaps are very small, and the small gaps are where the problem is. I said, "What's in the small gaps?" He said, "That's what we're trying to determine." He's been trying to determine it for 7 years. What the witnesses added in detailed follow-up interviews went beyond the basic timeline. What they added was behavior. The Nordstroms at 110 placed Rachel ascending normally, smiling, asking about the wildflowers. Nothing unusual in her manner. Gerald Cross, ascending at 114, remembered her stepping aside to let him pass on the narrow section. A brief exchange about the view. He noted nothing unusual. But Karen Whitmore, the mother who gave the most detailed account, described something at 117 that took on a different weight in the weeks after the search. She said, "I noticed she didn't look up when we went by. Most people say something, even just hello. She was focused on the slope. I kept expecting to see her start climbing. She was just standing there when we lost sight of her. Standing there, not moving." At 1:17 p.m., the ascending couple who confirmed Rachel's absence at 119 added one detail worth noting. The woman said she had specifically scanned the slope because she had heard the Whitmore family talking about something above the trail. She said, "I was looking for what they had been excited about. I scanned the whole slope. There was nobody there." 4 independent groups, 4 separate accounts with no coordination between them. A 2-minute window that should have been the answer. Instead, it became the question. One element of the witness timeline received less attention than it deserved. Sound. The Whitmore family was roughly 50 meters from Rachel when they last saw her. In the 2 minutes of descent after losing sight of her, they covered at least 100 meters along the ridge. The ascending couple was approaching from below during that same window. None of them heard anything. Not a fall. Not a shout. Not the sound of someone moving quickly through vegetation. I have stood at that section of trail. I have stood at the viewpoint and called out toward the slope. Sound carries there. The slope above reflects it. The talus below reinforces it. The ridge acts as a channel. In calm July conditions, a shout from the slope is audible for a considerable distance in both directions. The search coordinator noted this in his incident report. He wrote that the absence of any reported sound from witnesses in audible range during the relevant window was an observation that the investigation had not been able to account for. Every physical scenario that ends with Rachel incapacitated or in distress on that slope, a fall, a medical event, a rapid traverse that went wrong, produces sound. The witnesses were close enough, and the conditions were favorable enough that they should have heard something. They heard nothing. I do not know what that means. I know what it rules out. It rules out most of the easy explanations. Day 4 brought a helicopter with thermal imaging equipment, the relevant slope, the drainage below, the ridge extensions in both directions, all covered. The pilot flagged 2 signatures. One was confirmed as a large animal on a subsequent visual pass. The second was ambiguous, too brief at the edge of the sensor's resolution in the rockier terrain above the wildflower meadow. A ground team reached the flagged area that afternoon. They found nothing. The terrain was a section of rock outcroppings a couple of 100 meters above and east of where Rachel had been seen. Loose rock, lichen, scattered alpine flowers. No sign of Rachel. The thermal signature remained classified as indeterminate, not confirmed, not excluded. I have asked about that signature many times in the years since. The answer is always the same. Day 4 also produced something else. A search team working the eastern ridge extension found a single boot print. One print, right foot, in soft soil near a seep, roughly 400 meters east of Rachel's last known position. Fresh. Assessed within 24 hours of discovery. The search extended east along the ridge. Nothing else was found. The print was consistent with Rachel's boot size, a common size, consistent with any number of hikers who might have been in the area. Every registered hiker from that day was accounted for. Every registered hiker. The print remains in the evidence record, unresolved. Day 7. The formal search was suspended. I want to be precise about what that means. It does not mean the case was closed. It means the large-scale coordinated operation, at peak, 68 people and 2 aerial assets, was ended because continued operations had become resource-intensive without new leads. 68 people over 7 days. 1 boot print, unconfirmed. 1 thermal signature, indeterminate. 1 canine track ending at the wildflower section. Nothing else. A ranger met me at the Cedar Fork trailhead that evening and returned Rachel's pack to me. Her fleece was inside. So were 2 energy bar wrappers, a water filter, a folded park map she had marked in pencil on the drive up. I put the pack in the back seat of the car and sat in the front for a long time before I could start the engine. My children were waiting at home. I have told them the same thing every year since. We know what we know, and we keep looking. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from reviewing conclusions that don't conclude anything. The National Park Service found no evidence of foul play, no evidence of accident, no evidence of voluntary departure. Circumstances classified as undetermined. Case remains open. The FBI, notified due to the circumstances, found no persons of interest, no financial or personal indicators of planned disappearance, no connection to any known criminal activity. They deferred to the NPS state law enforcement in a review conducted 6 months later, at my request, reached the same conclusions. They noted the unusual witness circumstances and described them as presenting an investigative challenge that existing evidence could not resolve. Investigative challenge. That phrase has defined 7 years of my life. What 3 separate agencies agreed on was this: the evidence does not support voluntary departure. Beyond that, they could not say what happened. I spent 18 months receiving quarterly updates that contained no new information before I understood that waiting for the agencies to find something had become a form of inaction I could no longer afford. I hired a private investigator. His name was Robert Kern, 20 years in law enforcement before going private. He specialized in missing persons cases. He spent 4 months on Rachel's case. He verified the witness timeline independently, conducting his own interviews, and found the original accounts consistent and credible across all 6 witnesses. And then he found one thing the original investigation had not pursued. Gerald Cross, the solo ascending hiker who passed Rachel at 1:14, had mentioned in his original statement that he had seen another hiker on the trail above Rachel when he passed her, an adult with a backpack moving upward. He had not focused on the person and could not identify gender or specifics. This other hiker had never been identified. Gerald's mention had been noted in his original interview, but not aggressively pursued. At the time, the working assumption was a medical event or fall, and investigative attention was on terrain. Kern treated it differently. He pulled every trail register entry from the Cedar Fork trailhead for that morning. He cross-referenced every name against the witness accounts. Everyone was accounted for, except one. One solo registration whose presence could not be confirmed by any witness account. A first name I'll decline to publish, registered at 8:42 a.m., consistent with arriving at the relevant trail section in the early afternoon. No contact information beyond what was in the register. This person was never identified. Kern reported this to the NPS and the FBI. The FBI described it as a lead of unknown significance. I don't know if that person was on the trail. I don't know if they passed Rachel. There is no evidence connecting them to anything. But an unidentified solo hiker registered for the same trail on the same morning, whose presence cannot be confirmed or denied by any witness. That is in the record. And it became the thread that Francis Hooper would pull on 3 years later. Francis Hooper had spent over 2 decades working Pacific Northwest search operations. She had published peer-reviewed work on search methodology. She spent 2 months with the documentation. She said, "The witness timeline is the most complete I've seen in an outdoor disappearance case. Normally, ambiguity is where new information hides. Here, there is very little ambiguity, and the case is still open." She walked me through the physical scenarios one at a time. A fall into concealing terrain. The slope had been examined by multiple teams. She had visited it herself. She said, "I can't identify a terrain feature on that slope that would account for a person being out of sight within 50 meters of the trail. That doesn't mean there isn't one. It means I didn't find it." A rapid traverse outside the search zone. The zone was defined by what was reachable in 2 minutes. The witnesses saw Rachel stationary. She said, "Unless she was moving before the Whitmores saw her, and their account doesn't suggest that, the traversal scenario is very tight." A medical event in a location the search missed. 7 days, 68 people, bounded terrain. She said, The GPS coverage logs are good, but search coverage is never perfect. I can't rule it out. I also can't construct it. She said, I don't have a scenario that works. What I can describe, physically, not evidentially, is a route that accounts for the physical evidence. She described it carefully. Rachel reaching the rock outcropping roughly 60 meters above the trail in approximately 2 minutes, concealed from the ascending couple behind it, then moving into the lateral drainage above. She was careful about every word. She said, I want to be precise about what that means. I'm describing what the terrain allows. The evidence doesn't support this scenario. It also doesn't exclude it. That's the position I'm in. The GPS analysis she conducted found a gap in the lateral drainage coverage, a narrow corridor where 2 search teams' tracks ran roughly parallel without fully converging, with a short window between passes. The drainage connects to unmaintained game trails, descending toward a forest road. The forest road reaches the park boundary without passing the search command post at the trailhead. She said, 3 things that might be connected, might not be. I can't tell you which. 3 documented facts with no confirmed connection to each other. The coverage gap, the exit route, the unidentified trail registration from the morning of Rachel's disappearance. They are there. They are not resolved. I sat with the Hooper analysis for a long time, not because it answered anything, because it was the first framework that could accommodate all the physical evidence without requiring something impossible. Physically possible, evidentially unsupported. That is a very specific kind of not knowing. For a long time, I thought the camera was a detail in the case. At some point, I understood it was the case. Rachel had taken it with her when she left the viewpoint at 1:12. She had taken it specifically to photograph the wildflowers. The last image on it, the second wildflower photograph, was time-stamped 1:11. There was a period, probably the 2nd or 3rd year, when I would go through the photographs at night. Sitting at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, the 2 images of the tamarack drainage, the wildflower photograph. I would look at each one and see only the time it was taken. 1:09, 1:10, 1:11. At some point, I stopped seeing what Rachel had chosen to photograph and started seeing timestamps with pictures attached. I noticed that recently. It seemed worth noting. The second wildflower image is a good photograph. The light catches the slope in a way that makes the flowers look almost luminous against the granite. She saw that. She composed it deliberately. The pause before the second shot, the habit she had, is visible in the image itself. She was paying attention. Then she put the camera in her pack and went back down to where I was sitting. And that is where the timestamp raised a question I have not been able to resolve. Rachel left the viewpoint at 1:12, but the last photograph was taken at 1:11. That means the second wildflower photograph was taken before she came back to tell me she was going to photograph the wildflowers. She had already been to the slope. She had already taken the photographs. She came back to the viewpoint, told me she was going back up, and left again, without the camera, which was in her pack. Outer pocket. Zipped. If that sequence is correct, she had already photographed what she said she was going back to photograph. She did not need to go back up the trail. She chose to. Robert Kern laid out the 2 possibilities plainly. Either Rachel left without the camera, meaning the 1:11 image was the last time she touched it, or she returned it to the pack before I noticed, and walked back up the trail having already finished what she said she was going to do. Either way, something in that sequence is not fully accounted for. Ranger Teresa Blaine, who took over the open case 2 years after the disappearance and has worked it since, told me at the 3-year mark that the camera was the piece of physical evidence she kept returning to. She said, "The timeline is difficult to reconcile. The sequence raises questions that the evidence doesn't fully answer. Beyond that, I wouldn't draw conclusions from what we have." I asked whether the evidence suggested Rachel had known something was going to happen. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I can't say that. There are several possible interpretations. What I can say is that the evidence doesn't fit the profile of an accidental disappearance. What it does fit, I don't know." I've thought about Rachel on that slope at 111, with the camera, taking a photograph she was satisfied with. Coming back down, putting the camera in the pack, telling me she was going back up. I don't know what changed between the photograph and the decision to return. I don't know what she saw, or thought, or noticed in those few minutes on the slope. But I think that is where the question lives. I returned to the trail for the 4th time in September, 3 months ago. My daughter drove me to the Cedar Fork trailhead. She offered to come with me. I told her I needed to do it alone. I hiked up in cool morning air, reaching the high point by mid-morning. The tamarack drainage was visible to the north, gray-green under an overcast sky. I stood at the high point for a while. Rachel and I had eaten lunch here. I had a clear memory of the way she had looked north at that view, and told me the light was wrong for a photograph, and she would come back in October when the angle changed. She did not come back in October. I walked down to the viewpoint. I sat on the rock bench. I thought about her taking those photographs. The pause, the considered second image, the fact that it is better than the first. Then I walked up to the wildflower section. I stood where the Whitmores had stood when they last saw her. The wildflowers were done for the year, dried to brown and seed. The rock outcropping was there, roughly 60 meters above, exactly where it has always been. I walked the slope to the outcropping. 1 minute and 52 seconds. I checked my watch. I stood behind the rock. The trail below was visible. From behind the outcropping, a person standing still would not be visible to someone on the trail. Above it, the terrain became more difficult. Loose rock, steeper grade, exposure. Beyond that, the lateral drainages running down from the ridge. I sat behind the rock for a while. The wind moved through the dried flower stalks on the slope. The trail below was empty. I thought about Rachel paying attention. Then I walked back down. The argument Rachel and I had that morning has been raised as relevant by people who have followed this case. I want to address it once. We argued, and we reconciled. A couple passed us during the argument, and again 20 minutes later, walking together and talking normally. Investigators confirmed this. Rachel had a retirement account, a life insurance policy, a car registration due in 3 months, already marked on our calendar. She had plans she was looking forward to. She had 2 children she was deeply present in the lives of. The investigators examined our finances and our relationship with the same rigor they examine everything else. They found nothing to suggest voluntary departure. Rachel did not leave. Something happened to her in 2 minutes on that trail. I know that with the same certainty I know anything. The question was never whether she left. The question has always been what those 2 minutes contained. And for 6.5 of the 7 years since that Saturday in July, I had been asking the wrong version of that question. I want to end with Gerald Cross. He passed Rachel at 1:14. 3 minutes before the Whitmores saw her stationary at the trail's edge, he gave his original statement in the days after the search. 18 months later, Robert Kern interviewed him again. Kern asked him to describe Rachel's expression and manner when they passed. Gerald said, "She seemed like she was waiting for something. Not distressed, not in a hurry. Just paused. Like she was expecting something to happen." Kern asked, "Did she seem like she was looking for someone?" Gerald Cross thought about it for a long moment. He said, "No, not looking for someone. More like she knew something was about to happen, and she was getting ready for it." I do not know what Gerald Cross perceived. People reconstruct moments in the light of what comes next, and what came next was enormous. His interpretation may be retrospective construction. I've told myself that many times. But then I think about what the Whitmores observed 3 minutes later. Rachel at the edge of the trail, stationary, looking up at the slope, not climbing, not photographing. The camera was in her hand, but the last photograph had been taken at 1:11, not acknowledging the family as they passed, standing still, looking at something on the slope. At 1:17, I went back to the trail in September and stood where the Whitmores had stood, and I looked at the same slope, and I asked the question I have always asked. What was she looking at? The slope was open, bright in September light, grass and dried flower stalks, and the gray granite of the outcropping, and above it the ridge. There was nothing on that slope to look at. There was nothing on that slope to look at on a July afternoon 7 years ago, when my wife stood at the edge of the trail and didn't move, and didn't speak, and didn't lift the camera. I have been asking that question for 7 years, and standing there in September, in the same light, I understood for the first time that I had been asking the wrong one, because the camera in her hand had taken its last photograph at 1:11. She had stopped photographing 6 minutes before the Whitmores saw her. She had stopped moving before anyone saw her stationary. She was still when Gerald Cross passed at 1:14. She had been still for 3 minutes before the first person saw her that way. Whatever she was looking at, whatever she was waiting for, it had already started at 1:11. At 1:11, standing on a slope above an empty trail, before any witness had arrived, before anyone was watching, something changed. And no witness account covers that moment. That 3-minute window before Gerald Cross. Before the timeline that should have explained everything. That is where the case actually begins. For 6.5 years, I had been studying the wrong window. The question I should have been asking from the beginning is the one I have no witness to answer. What happened at 1:11? I stood on that trail in September and felt the particular weight of having looked in the wrong direction for a very long time. I do not know what Rachel saw. I do not know what she was waiting for. I do not know what those 2 minutes contained. What I know is that my wife was on that slope at 1:11, alone, before anyone was watching. That she took a photograph she was satisfied with. That she came back down to where I was sitting and told me she wanted to go back up. And that whatever she decided in those minutes between the photograph and the conversation, whatever she saw, or understood, or chose. She had already decided before she spoke to me. She had already decided before she said she would be back in 10 minutes. I have spent 7 years trying to understand what happened on that trail. I think I've been starting the story at the wrong place. And the place where it actually starts is the one place I cannot reach. 1:11 p.m., a slope above an empty trail. My wife, alone, with a photograph she was satisfied with. Whatever came next, whatever she knew or saw or chose, it began there. And it has never been explained. This story is a work of fiction inspired by real wilderness disappearance cases and missing persons investigations.